Okay, I think we are now live. It says live in the upper left-hand corner, so. Okay, well, hey everyone. I have a little intro I'm going to read here. So, welcome to the Social Distance Book Fest, where you can stay home while supporting authors in indie bookstores and hopefully add a few new books to your TBR. I definitely did that in preparation for this panel. I'm Mara from Books Like Whoa. I am she, her, hers. And I'm kind of known as an omnivore on my channel. I read everything from mystery to romance to classic. I mean, I read like anything pretty much. But I am known for my mystery content because I love Agatha Christie. She's my favorite author, which I assume is why they deputized me to host the entire range of ooky spooky, everything from whodunit to horror, everything in between is what we'll talk about today. And I am excited to get this panel started. So in a moment, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, but if you're wondering what the Social Distance Book Fest is, here's a brief overview. This is an all-day event created by a dedicated group of bookworms from all corners of the internet. It includes 18 panels, more than 80 authors, virtual fandom meetups, virtual signing opportunities, and some amazing giveaways. And some gorgeous pictures on Instagram that I could never do. Check out our website and social media linked below for all the details, and check out our bookshop.org page where you can order books from featured authors and support indie bookstores. 10% of the proceeds will be donated to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's COVID-19 fund. We hope you take advantage of everything the Book Fest has to offer. And in case you miss any interesting panels, check out our playlist of all the panels and meetups, which will continue to be available for viewing. With that said, let's hear from our panelists. So go ahead and introduce yourself, your preferred pronouns, and tell us about your book. Anne, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Anne Davila Cardinal, and I'm the author of 5 Midnights, which came out last year, and the sequel Category 5, which comes out on June 2nd from Tortine. I live in Vermont. I also recruit for the Vermont College of Fine Arts MFA in Writing and Writing for Children programs. And I'm very excited to be a part of this. And I really appreciate having an opportunity to remote celebrate books and be on a panel with these incredible writers.
Grady, how about you?
Sure. Also, just to let people know, I'm muting my mic because some people have decided to do construction right above me. So I'll be muting when I'm not talking. I'm Grady Hendricks. I'm the author of the new book, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. And for the first time for me, hit the New York Times bestseller list. It's really awesome. I never thought it would happen. I write mostly horror. I did a book called Horror Store about a haunted IKEA, my best friend's exorcism. I wrote a book about the paperback horror boom of the 70s and 80s called Paperbacks from Hell. And I mostly write horror, but the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, it's set in the 90s, and it's about a bunch of women who have a book club in South Carolina, where I'm from, who only read true crime. So I think that may be why I slithered on this panel. He, his, him. Yeah, that's me.
Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Thomas. You can also call me Lizzie. My book, Catherine House, is coming out May 12th. Let me see. It just arrived, my copy, so let me go grab one.
Oh, that's exciting. I will tell you, I was trying to get a hold of everyone's books so I could show them, and it is so hard to get any books right now. I could really only get one. So I'm glad that you're at least getting your copy.
Yay! It's real. It exists. This is my debut. It's coming out with HarperCollins May 12th. It's a gothic literary suspense. It takes place at a mysterious cult-like college deep in the woods of Pennsylvania. It's been a blast to write and wonderful to speak with all of you. Pronouns are she, her, hers.
Great. Megan?
Hey, I'm Megan Campisi, she, her, hers, and I'm also a debut author. My books, I've got the British and the American. So one is Sin Eater and one is The Sin Eater. This is a historical fiction mystery, and it's about a 14-year-old girl who is condemned to be a sin eater, which means she hears deathbed confessions and then eats foods associated with the sins on people's coffins, taking them onto her own soul. And so she becomes a social pariah in this role, and she's not allowed to speak. People won't touch her. But throughout the book, she turns this curse into an unexpected source of power as she uncovers a series of murders that reach up to the queen and sets out to solve them. So it's about a very isolated woman persevering to find her strength and her people, which is feeling unfortunately timely right now.
You timed that well. You'll ride the same wave as Contagion. Mm-hmm. Everyone going for it. Callie, CL, I'm not sure which one you want to.
Yeah, sure. I'm Callie, otherwise known as CL Taylor. She, her, hers. I'm the only Brit on the panel. I've written now 7 psychological thrillers. The first 3 were published in the States, Before I Wake, The Lie, and The Missing. Currently trying to get someone in the States to take the rest of my books. I've had now, like Grady, I just had my 5th Sunday Times bestseller.
Congratulations! Congratulations!
On the 2nd of April, and it's about 3 lonely people who are all strangers. A security guard called Gareth, who lives with his mum, who's got dementia. A shop manager called Alice, who has been divorced for 2 years and has just started internet dating. And a woman called Ursula, who's 6'3". She's a courier. She's got a dark past and she's a kleptomaniac. And all their lives collide when a crime takes place in the shopping centre.
Ooh. Well, I can tell you, I was in London last year, and your cover for Sleep drew me in because I love isolated, kind of closed circle type mysteries. So this American liked it. They should bring it on over. Yeah.
You see it on the shoe. I had shoe posters for Sleep, which was a first for me.
Oh no, the one I picked up had like just the house. It looked a lot like that. Yeah. So anyway, I endorse. We should come over here. This other guy liked it. So. Okay, well, great. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So a lot of what we're exploring in this panel is just, as you can tell, even from the description of books, there's just a lot of different types of mystery, horror, thriller. I mean, there's a huge range sort of in this subcategory of books. So we're kind of just exploring authors who often get shelved in the similar section of the bookstore, but have very different types of books. So I guess I'll open up the first one of what kind of just drew you to this genre in general and your subgenre in particular. Was there a specific book that really kind of like made you say like, I could write this? Just whoever wants to dive in there.
I completely undersold my book. I didn't do she, her, my pronouns. But I'd love to answer this because I was raised on horror and I have this sort of theory that it gets you through difficult times. And I think that was true when I was young. And now in terms of writing for young adults, I was particularly affected. Forest of Hands and Teeth by Carrie Ryan. I read that in 2009 and it was just such a masterful version of the genre in young adult age. And I also loved Grady's, the most recent one I read was My Best Friend's Exorcism, which I loved. And is that,
thank you. I appreciate it.
It's not quite as YA, but I loved it.
It's sold as adult fiction, but I've seen it shelved as YA. I could care less, man.
Well, I know that we've got some young adult and some adult. Is there, I mean, you said you don't care which one you're shelved with. Do you sort of write with an audience in mind? Is there a specific audience you're targeting?
Me? No, I mean, just normal humans or abnormal humans. I kind of leave that stuff up to the marketing department. I've written some YA in the past a long time ago. And I feel like the production process is really different, or I could have just been at a weird house. But I feel like editors tend to be very, very cautious with YA, or the ones I've worked with, because I think it's the only genre where the person who writes it isn't the person who reads it. Like most genres, are written by the intended audience, like it's usually dudes writing military sci-fi. It's usually, women writing historical romances. I mean, it's just the way it balances out. It's, and so, but YA, it's like adults writing for kids. So I think editors tend to be very careful to make sure they get it right and doesn't overstep the line or anything. So yeah, it might have just been the editors I was working with, but I don't care, man. I just want people to read my books.
Yeah. What book drew you into horror?
For horror, I didn't read horror as a kid. I thought the covers were too gross. I mean, I read Stephen King and like Clive Barker, but as an adult, I just found more and more what I was writing was leaning in that direction. So I just jumped in and embraced it. So, I mean, if there was a book that sent me in this direction, it wasn't really a book. It was a bunch of books. Like I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and my dad was convinced me. He was like, Charleston, where I'm from, if there's a nuclear war, we're in the top 10 targets and we're going to be wiped out in 28 minutes. Everyone we know will be dead within 28 minutes. I was like 7. And so
my family.
It's like, this is heavy.
So I really embraced books like The Third World War and, all this like post-apocalyptic fiction about people surviving nuclear war. Because I was like, yeah, I won't die in the first, 28 minutes. I'll be in a dune buggy with an AK-47 fighting mutants. And I think that sort of optimism like really made horror appealing, because horror like begins where most genre ends. Like in a lot of books, you die, the end. And horror, it's like you die, chapter 1. So the optimism of horror sort of drew me in.
I love that. I've never heard someone talk about the optimism of horror, but that's great. What about the rest of you? What book or what drew you to your kind of subgenre?
Well, I would say with historical fiction, I think that there's an escapism that comes from looking at the past. But at the same time, one of the things I love about it is it of course, also sheds light on the present. So one of the authors who really drew me in was C.J. Sansom, who writes Tudor Mysteries, the Shard Lake series. His first one was Dissolution, and he just had a recent one called Tombland. And what I love about him is yes, it's in this vivid historical setting, but the characters tend to be marginalized individuals in their society. And that's something that is really close to my heart in my writing. And I think those are stories that need to be heard. And so I love how that sheds light on, what people are going through today.
I agree. I don't write history, but I think it's very interesting how so much of horror and thriller, it often has very strong tropes. Like there's kind of, the jaded detective, there's the damsel in distress, there's, this kind of set series of characters. And I think that's so much fun to play with. So I watched a lot of like thriller horror movies and that type of thing as a kid. And then in terms of reading, I loved like Jane Eyre was my favorite book growing up, which I was like,
that's my favorite book. I'm with you. Yep.
It's like a really funny book I was a kid. I like understood half of what was happening, but there's just something about, that gothic drama. It's the mood of it is so strong. And there was something about it that I just found so delicious, so enticing. And so as I became older, I think I wanted to kind of create those kinds of moods, but then also to kind of play with all the various tropes that are in those books.
I actually started my career writing romantic comedies. My first, yeah, I know. My first 2 books were published by Orion, and actually, with the second book that I wrote out of the 2-book contract, I went pretty dark. And my editor said, you can't have your characters having this kind of really dark past because it's a rom-com. And it was then that I sort of started to think, maybe I'm writing the wrong genre. And then when I was out of contract, S.J. Watson's Before I Go to Sleep became massive, and so did Elizabeth Haynes' Into the Darkest Corner. And I had always assumed that crime was detectives, private eyes, police procedurals, all of this kind of thing, and that I couldn't be a crime author. But what I loved about psych thrillers is that it's bad stuff happening to ordinary people. And as a reader, you can put yourself in the shoes of the main character. What would I do if I was getting strange notes slipped under the door, or if I thought I was being stalked, and all of that kind of thing. And I've got a background in psychology, so I love working out why people behave the way they do, why they think the way they do, what happened in their past to make them the kind of person they are now. And I think that all came together. And now nobody tells me off for writing dark stuff in my books.
See, now you would have to write indie romance. I feel like all the online only stuff is like super dark. So you should go back, test the waters again.
Yeah.
So as we're talking about kind of moving from being a reader of the genre to a writer, how has that changed your perspective on the genre that you now write in? How do you think about plotting in particular, I would think? Because I mean, I love, I read a range of mysterious type books, and I always wonder how would I go about trying to plot something that I enjoy reading? So how has becoming a writer in your genre changed your perspective?
I don't know if it did change in terms of I thought it would be difficult, and it is really difficult. I always thought, I was like, oh man, like this plot is like, wow, that and all the plot twists. I always kind of I always thought that it would be really difficult, and I think it is difficult. I mean, maybe some people find it easy, but it's not. It's not me. I think the thing that I've had to learn is realizing that sometimes you can't just push through not knowing how you're going to solve a particular plotting problem yet, and realizing that you may have to like step away from the manuscript for a second and take a walk, work on something else, and like just breathe. I'm so used to in so many other areas of life, you could kind of push through certain problems. But I think that sometimes with plotting problems, you kind of have to wait to realize how you're going to solve this, what's going to feel natural and what's a good way that's going to feel true to the story. And sometimes you just kind of have to take a breath and wait for that solution to come for you. And it takes a certain amount of patience that doesn't always come naturally.
I think being a writer makes it much harder to be a reader in some ways, particularly in my own genre, because I don't know about everybody else, but I'm sent lots of proofs, advanced copies of books that they want me to read and maybe give a quote to. And it's a rare book that I can lose myself in now, because my brain automatically goes to, is this a red herring? Is this leading where I think it is? Is this person trustworthy? And unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, I'm right. And so that for me, that takes a bit of the excitement and the mystery out of reading. So when I do find a book that keeps me on the back foot and keeps me guessing, then I'm like, whoa, okay, respect to this author, because, they've wrong-footed me. But I will often read books in different genres, because for example, a historical, I haven't got the first clue about sort of how to bring a historical together, or a horror. I've never written a horror. So I can still lose myself in books if it's a different genre than I write myself.
Mm-hmm. I can see that.
I mean, I have great respect now that I know how difficult it is to like plant, these things now when I read them, I'm trying to glean what I can from them. But I will say I was not a plotter originally. And I had this idea, oh no, that would interfere with my creativity. And then I wrote like 3 novels, and I had to put in structure afterwards. And it's like building a body and putting in the bones last. Yeah. It makes your life so much more difficult. So now I'm embracing plotting and using one that's closer to screenwriting, which is what made sense to me, because a lot of them turn my brain off. Snowflake one with a spreadsheet, So now I could just sort of do it, and a lot of it does come when you're going along. But I needed to have and mystery and horror and thrillers. You have to have it's much more careful, and so you really need to have that plan. And so I've sort of learned to embrace it.
Yeah, I came to, this is my first novel, and I have before this been a playwright. And so I think that I was making a transition, because in playwriting, you are relying on dialogue and you're relying on physical action to communicate the story. But in my book, the main character is forbidden from speaking. So I actually had to rely quite a bit on that physical storytelling to communicate the plot, to communicate information between characters to the reader. But I'm a big planner. So I get a big board. I'm a really visual person, and I get a ton of sticky notes in different colors that represent each of the threads going through. My mystery is super complicated. So there were moments that I had to kind of, wait a minute, refresh, how is this working? And make a big arc. I mean, the board took up half of my wall. I put it up very high so my kids couldn't steal things off of it. And then, of course, because it's historical, I have to be immersed in the time period. So I would get as many books as I could, particularly for this book on like the criminal underworld. And then I'd just be reading them on the subway. I'd be reading them I teach at a theater conservatory. So in the faculty room with my breast milk pump, I'd be reading a book. And, that was my life for the 2 years of writing, was the research as I was going along, and then very careful plotting.
I actually have Callie's problem, which is, I did this book about 70s and 80s horror fiction. So I read a ton of that stuff still, just because there's a lot of it, and just work purposes. But I find myself really not reading a lot of modern horror just because I'm really judgmental about it. And no one deserves that. That's mostly my own internalized self-loathing. So I read mostly in other genres. But in terms of like stuff that helps me with plotting, there's sort of 3 things that have really helped me. And one is screenwriting. I do a fair amount of that. And having to boil something down to a log line, often having that one sentence that defines my book, I'll get lost in the middle, and going back to that will help me reorient myself. And also the idea of, there's this great story that when like Stephen Sondheim was writing West Side Story, he wrote Maria, and like the director's like, yeah, but what's he doing in this? He's like, well, he's singing the song. He's like, but what's he doing? And I see in a lot of books that a character will be doing, and they'll have a realization or be thinking about something or something, and they're not doing anything. They're driving alone in their car, or they're sitting in their living room, or having a cup of coffee. And so if you look at my early books, like Horror Store, my first novel, like there's like 3 scenes that take place with someone alone in a car. And if I have to put someone in a car now, someone's in there with them, talking to them, or they're lost, or they're, something's happening. And then comedy really helped me a lot with writing, because like horror, it's set up payoff. And the more you can delay the payoff, and the more the payoff is surprising but seems inevitable because of the pieces you made people forget earlier, and the more specific it is, like in comedy, someone never, a human walked into a place. It's like a priest walks into a bar, right? And the more authority you have with comedy, the better. Like a joke that's like stand-up comedians aren't like telling jokes about a piece of string walking into a bar. They tell jokes like, I walked into a bar. Like, it's they take the authority. I'm the one telling this joke because it happened to me, which really helps me a lot. And the third thing is magic. I don't do magic. I find it scary and weird. But the whole idea of sort of misdirection is really, really important to me, to sort of get people looking over here while I'm doing something over there. And I actually find myself reading a lot of books about magic, which is just maybe a way to procrastinate, but also I say it's to help me plot.
Yeah, I think I'm somebody who tends to like, I do like a classic sort of like psychological thriller whodunit, but I do always get excited when the question of if magic's going to come in a mystery. I think that's always thrilling. Let's see, what else were you going to talk about here? Oh, I was going to ask you guys, who do you think are the innovators in your genre today? Because I think that, as somebody who keeps an eye on the front list a lot, like I'm always kind of looking and seeing what's coming out and what's interesting. I'm interested from a writer's perspective, what catches your eye, and if there's any books coming out this year or maybe next year that are, you think kind of special or innovative in some way, aside from your own, obviously.
I love anything written by Paul Tremblay. He has a book called Growing Things. That's a collection of stories. And he actually just wrote Survivor Song, which is about a pandemic, and it comes out in August. So I'm like champing at the bit for that. I also am obsessed with Gabino Iglesias. I've read basically all his stuff. He writes what he calls Barrio Noir. And it's horror with this sort of cultural, because I'm Latinx, and I love that richness that he brings to it. All takes place in the Southwest. Very dark, fabulous, beautiful writing. So those are the things that this year I've been really excited about.
It's so funny. Both of those are on my My little golden pop.
You don't have Survivor Song, do you? Oh,
I
I'm so
do,
jealous.
yeah, or over there. Because I think
So jealous.
I'm sorry. I have to say something. Well, the last time I was in the office, they're like, "Do you want to still take it, please?" When I was in the office, whenever that was. So.
Cool.
Yeah.
I can't, I'm struggling to think of anything that I've been sent recently that I'm thinking this is particularly innovative. But I would mention Sarah Pinborough. I think her book was a big success in the States as well, Behind Her Eyes, because she was the first author to add a kind of, over here to make it big anyway, to add a kind of more supernatural, surreal angle to a psychological thriller without giving too much away about the book, the whole lucid dreaming thing. You know, there's a good reason that her marketing team used the WTF ending hashtag because it was, nobody had read anything like that in a psychological thriller, and it did split people. Some people loved it, some people not so much, but it got everybody talking. But I think it's quite hard to be super innovative because that can scare publishers. They're a bit like, whoa, you know, there's a little bit of a pressure to sort of stay in your box a bit. You can go a bit out there. So, for example, Strangers is the first time I've written a book with 3 main characters instead of 1. All my earlier books had, you know, somebody called them women in peril books. And I wanted to move away from that slightly and explore 3 characters and have their lives intersect. But it is hard to be too out there. But, you know, I'm always looking and seeing when publishers start making a noise. HarperCollins are making a noise about a book called Girl A at the moment. So I've requested a proof to see if if it lives up to the hype.
Yeah, no, Sarah Pinborough here on BookTube is very divisive. People either love that book or hate it. But I think that's kind of a sign of an interest. I mean, to your point, innovation, because it's not going to be something everybody's into, but it provokes a response if nothing else.
I don't have a super recent book, but and it's a very well-known book, but Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad in terms of historical fiction, because it offers an alternate history. And I think that's a very interesting place to go, especially with something as well-known as The Underground Railroad. And I think that book, I mean, it's a thriller to a certain, you know, it was harrowing. And I think that seeing an author really go in his own direction and kind of find a new perspective, I think it enriched my understanding of that time period, even though so much of it was alt history.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of the stuff I read that I find really fascinating is older, because I feel like there is, like you were saying, Callie, the issue of publishers really, they like what works and then doing that again to some extent. Southern Book Club, it's about, the women in it are mostly housewives. They don't work. They don't have 9-to-5 jobs. They raise families. And I got so much pushback from my publisher writing a book about middle-aged women. Who's going to want to read about that? And writing a book about a vampire. Vampires are over.
Never. Vampires are never over. I don't know who needs to hear that, but they're never over.
Middle-aged women, who read.
Well, exactly. Well, also my point was these are women who are underestimated. That's part of the point of the book, and that didn't wash. It took me a couple of years to convince them to go for this book. But I keep reading. You know, before horror kind of flamed out in the mid 90s and turned into thrillers, and specifically serial killer thrillers, specifically really, really sexually violent and gory serial killer thrillers. There were so many authors doing amazing stuff. I've been working with this publisher, Valancourt, to bring some of their stuff back into print. But Barry Wood, who wrote this amazing Jewish horror novel called The Tribe in '81, we just brought back into print. Joan Sampson's The Auctioneer, which I think is it's like an American classic it was this big book and it came out, got a big push. It was a big bestseller. And then like 3 weeks after it came out, she died of brain cancer. And, and so it's like without an author to do author events, it sort of just disappeared. It's an amazing book. And it's horror, but it's sort of like Stephen King's Needful Things if Cormac McCarthy had written it, just this very flinty, very New England, very American kind of book. In terms of people now, I don't know if anyone knows Stephen Graham Jones, but he has a book coming out in July called The Only Good Indians. And Stephen is Blackfoot. And the book is, he grew up in, I think, West Texas. And the book's set out west. And it's a very much a pickup trucks and, you know, coolers full of discount store beer kind of book. But it's about dudes who grew up on the reservation, and some get out and some don't. And also there's like a shape-shifting elk woman who's murdering some of them. But it's one of those books that's, I've heard people say they don't like Stephen's language before, but I find it really appealing. It's very much guy at a bar telling you a story kind of language. And it is really nice to get lost in a world that's totally, I'm a nice boy from South Carolina, like people living, you know, in trailer parks out in Texas. That's weird to me. So it was nice to feel like I was in some kind of like science fiction world where they still drink Budweiser.
They still drink Budweiser. Yeah. I feel like all the craft breweries have banned Budweiser from anywhere within a 50-mile radius of metropolitan areas. Lizzie, what about you? Any books coming up that are exciting to you, or innovators?
I would say I would agree with the basic tone where it's, I think on one hand, I agree that it's hard to, I think a lot of times you see innovation after it's happened. You know, it's hard to see what is a trend and what is something that's like going to have really changed the tone of a conversation until, you know, years after it happened. So I think that that's kind of hard for me to think of now in terms of like what's coming out like this year or next year. And then also just on a personal level, like being that, you know, I'm publishing a book this year, it's like I can think of books that I know I've read copies of them that are coming out this year that I love, but I kind of like, I think you, to a certain extent, you kind of have to put on those like little horse blinders, you know, and like kind of not put, you know, your own brain on your own homework and just focus on what you're doing. But I also agree that I think that just also maybe it's partially because I love this type of thing, but the Sarah Pinborough having supernatural elements in books is something that I started to see more and something that I love. So I'm really excited for that.
Cool. Yeah. Well, and actually kind of some of the books that got mentioned maybe play into this a little bit. I think one thing that's exciting to me looking at kind of books in general, but specifically, I don't know. I think that there's certain stereotypes about mysteries, thrillers, horrors of who writes them and who is in them, and who the victims are. But I was wondering perspective from y'all on, do you see gains for diversity and inclusion in your subgenres in terms of the characters, settings, or in terms of who is actually getting the opportunity to have their books really pushed? Because I personally, as a reader, feel like there's been a much bigger emphasis kind of across the board in having that awareness or that lens. But I was just wondering kind of y'all's perspective on that.
I think it's much stronger in YA right now with the We Need Diverse Books movement. There's just much more of a focus on it. You know, we have a long way to go. And it's sort of interesting. 5 Midnights was the first book for teens in English based in Puerto Rico ever. And
really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And that makes me a little bit sad. I'm half, you know, and I would like to see writers on the island getting more published in the States. And so I think there's a lot more we can do, but I have seen, you know, definite strides, particularly in YA these days and children's literature.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think that is driving some of the then shifts in the adult space, because I think as those readers are aging up, there is this kind of implicit expectation of, you know, why publishing so white, why publishing so straight, why publishing so whatever. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping that what's happening in film is, I mean, the small steps, very small steps are going to start becoming broader, and just, you know, the political movements that we're seeing where a few more unheard voices are being heard, that will start spreading. But it does seem like it's very small steps.
Yeah.
What's interesting? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. There's been a big push here in the UK to try and have more diverse voices in crime fiction, particularly. We have seen that sort of reach out to the British Asian community. And there's Abir Mukherjee, who is a Scottish crime author, who's done really well. Wasim Khan, who's a baby elephant detective series, is doing really well.
Wait, is the baby elephant the detective, or is that just the name of the series?
Detective, I can't remember the exact title, but it's is it Inspector something and the baby elephant, something like that. But it's set in India, and there's a detective and his sidekick is a baby elephant.
Oh.
So it's like a cozy mystery, and yes, and it's just lovely. And I know several of the British Asian crime writers have got together a podcast called, what do they call it? Something like the Chili Crime. I can't remember, but they've set out a podcast, and they're trying to make it more inclusive and to reach out to their community to say, look, we're doing this, we're published, because there's such a big assumption that in order to get published, you need to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you need to know people in the publishing industry, you need to be middle class, and none of those are me. I got published by buying the artists and writers yearbook and looking through for agents and sending them my stuff. More work does need to be done within the Black community in the UK, though. Rachel Ward had a literary psych thriller published last year. Dorothy Coomson is like, she's the sort of the voice for the Black women writing crime in our generation. But the fact that I can't think of any more is a really bad thing. So a lot of British publishers and agents are setting up like mentorships and grants and that kind of thing, and to reach out to working class communities as well. So hopefully we'll start to see more coming in.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing that I've thought has been really great. I see it more in LA than I do in publishing, just because I don't know, I don't go to the right parties. But I had a project. A lot of my books, the main characters are women, and so I'm sorry about the construction, but I had a project that we really wanted to find a female showrunner for, and we just couldn't. This was within, last year, basically. I mean, everyone, if you were a woman and you had run a writer's room, or, even from a directing point of view, they got to the point where if you were a commercial director and you were just getting hired. And I think what a lot of people realized is sort of two things. One is that there just wasn't a backbench, and that was a problem. There just hadn't been enough women and people of color who'd been getting opportunities. And so suddenly when people are like, oh, this is actually important, there are none. Or very few. And so I think there's a real effort right now to build up those backbenches and to sort of get those opportunities going and get that out there. And which I think is great. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is the reason it's happening is because the people who are selling the shows, the people with the money, the platforms, the networks, all that, the studios, they're insisting on this. Like, most production companies would not care, but no one's going to give you the money. So you can still write across gender to some extent. Like no one's, if I have a show out there, they're going to be looking for a female showrunner, but I can be in the writer's room, et cetera, et cetera. If it's a project about a person of color, you need people of color in the writer's room, period, full stop. I mean, a few people don't do that, but there is an insistence from the top that has to happen, which I think is great. And there's also a real insistence on female directors, female showrunners, female writers for female-helmed properties, which I think is great. But that's coming top down. I had a script that was almost greenlit for a TV series. And at the last minute, the network's like, no, are you out of your freaking minds? We are not having a dude write an episode about a woman in a sort of Me Too situation. That's just not going to happen. And what was interesting is everyone along the line, every gatekeeper along the line, every producer, the executive producer, the showrunner, everyone was like cool with it. It was a good script. But the network's like, just absolutely not. Just on the face of it, no. Which, okay, I mean, hey, I didn't lose my house or anything. I'm fine to be rejected on those grounds. But it was interesting to see that the pushback on that came from the very top, the people who signed the checks, not from anyone along the food chain there. And I think that's what's going to change things in the long term, is the people who signed the checks insisting on a certain amount of representation.
Yeah, and I think that does come from viewers or from readers, kind of this idea of holding accountable of like, hey, we have more visibility than ever into kind of who is behind the scene, who is making the sausage.
I think that's true. And I think it's going to be very interesting now, because I think part of why publishing is so white is because, it tends to be, especially at the lower levels anyway, except for, really everything's at the very high levels. It's not a high paid profession. And it's headquartered in New York, basically, which is a really expensive city. So it's going to, as the industry kind of naturally attracts people who can take unpaid internships and who can stay with, I grew up in New York. So like, I work in the arts, which is kind of a similar thing, where it's like I was able when I was young to take unpaid internships because I could stay with my family because my family lives in New York. So I think that it's going to be interesting now to see with that literally in the past few weeks, so many people are working from home. And in some ways it's not working, but in some ways it is working. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if there are ways in which the publishing industry can be less headquartered in this extremely expensive city, and if that will change the makeup of the editors and the people who are the ones who are making decisions of what is chosen. I think that it's the same thing where it's the people who are at the top need to be the ones who are making the decisions about what gets chosen, and that's really going to have a huge effect. I think that on the whole, I've had a great experience with publishing my book. I think that the thing that's trickiest, especially in this moment, is that with diversity, it's hard with no matter what way in which you are not the majority, it's hard to feel that you are going to become a spokesperson for that sexuality, that gender, that race, whatever. Really the only way to solve that is to just have more and more and more voices. So I think that that's just going to be the trick, is that I think that publishers and editors, at least in my experience, are really open to having more voices, but there just needs to be more and more and more, not just one person of whatever.
No, I appreciate the diversity, even just in the perspectives here, hearing kind of where things are going. I mean, I know that is something that's very top of mind, at least here on BookTube, of how things are changing in that direction, how we want to see more change. So it's just interesting to kind of hear from the author's perspective, kind of where the perspectives are. I was wondering if each of you could maybe recommend, we've already gotten some great recommendations here, but a couple of just more book recommendations. People are always chomping at the bit to add to the TBR, especially right now when we're all kind of hunkered down. Any just book recommendations for people who maybe haven't tried horror before, or haven't tried a psychological thriller, or haven't tried historical fiction? A couple of books that you would recommend they start with.
Shall I go first? I would absolutely 100% recommend Into the Darkest Corner by Elizabeth Haynes. If you've never read a psychological thriller before, that is the best. It's about a woman who has escaped from an abusive relationship, and she has developed OCD. So she goes around double checking the doors, double locking, making sure she's safe. She's very, very fearful. And I won't say more than that, but it will have you on the edge of your seat, and you'll read it in one sitting. Just brilliant. If you haven't, if you've already read that, I hugely recommend books by Lucy Clark, Tammy Cohen, Mark Edwards. Gosh, there are so many. Nuala Edwards, CJ Cook. I'll stop there because I could just go on and on and on listing all my favorite psychological thriller authors.
I've not heard of any of these. This is so exciting. Usually.
I would say I love to give. Oh, sorry. I mean, it's such a classic. But anyone who hasn't read Rebecca, it's just I adore that book, and it's something when I was writing Catherine House, my book that's coming out, is something I thought of so much because I think of it as such a thriller. And I reread it recently. I was like, there's not much that happens in this book. It's so funny because I kind of misremembered it. I remembered it as just, you know, this hugely, it's so suspenseful, and it just kind of does keep you on the edge of your seat. And then I was reading, it's like she, not to give anything away, but she mostly goes to the house and then is kind of spooked out, and then they go on vacation. And it was like, there's not much, not much happens here. And you learn about things that happened in the past. But the actual plotting, there's in a very day-to-day way, not much happens to the main character. And I thought it's just so brilliant to kind of learn about atmosphere and mood, and about how so much of suspense is built on revealing information in a particular way, and about what's going on in a character's head. And it's just so much fun, and it's so gothic and delicious, and everything I love in a book. So very classic. It's wonderful.
I was just going to say, I reread Rebecca when I was writing Southern Book Club, and it's so amazing. And you're right, like half of the stuff that happens in that book are things she imagines, or she imagines conversations, she imagines scenarios, she remembers things, but it's crazy how like cringe inducing it is. It's so good. But I was going to say, you know, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood gets a lot of credit, I guess, for true crime, which I kind of think is bullshit. I mean, it's a perfectly fine book, but like it mostly got a lot of credit because it was like a respectable person writing true crime who like wrote for the New Yorker. And one book I stumbled across, or not really stumbled across, it's like saying you stumbled across like the Taj Mahal, but Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me is the first real book, the first real modern true crime novel. It's 1980, and it really defined the genre. And it's amazing. It is really, really amazing. I don't know if people know it, but I couldn't
finish it. It's scary. Like it was just like I mean,
do you want to tell people
what the
I mean, is? Anne Rule was basically a housewife. She was a single mom trying to raise newly divorced, or relatively newly divorced, trying to raise 4 kids. And she made money freelancing as a writer, a freelancer for true crime magazines, which were, you know, grocery store tabloid stuff. And she got her first book deal for like $10,000 to do a book on what was being called the Coed murders at the time in the Pacific Northwest. And those turned out to be what we know now are the Ted Bundy killings. And they were perpetrated by her very good friend, Ted Bundy, who worked next to her at a suicide hotline. And one of the amazing things to me about this book is so often in true crime, a woman in the story is a cadaver who is then investigated. And Anne Rule puts herself front and center in this story and really doesn't let herself off the hook. Sort of, how did she not see that this nice guy is also this person she's investigating? And there's really, I mean, there's some of the set pieces in it. After he's arrested in Colorado and released for some murders that there's a lot of evidence he committed. They meet in a bar in the middle of nowhere to have a drink and for him to convince her that he is not a bad guy. And it's this long set piece with them getting drunker and drunker over the course of this rainy afternoon as people kind of trickle out of this bar and sort of leave them. It's one of the most tense things I've ever read. And it's truly a great book that does it. And it's really the fact that it was such a hit, and the fact that it was the beginning of a sort of a wave of these mass market true crime books. And the fact that it was mostly found success as a mass market paperback really color people's perceptions of it as sort of this low class, tawdry book. It's her sense of detail, her sense of when to drop the next bit of information. She's really, really an impeccable stylist.
Oh, okay. You've convinced me. I've got to get back to it and try to get through it. It just because it's so tense, because you as the reader know.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's mind F.
I just recently reread Neil Gaiman's Ocean at the End of the Lane. it's just a stunning piece of literature, and it's I don't know whether you can classify it horror or fantasy. It's something in between, but it just the way he built. He's a master. But I have to say, this book, Frozen Charlotte by Alex Bell, is the one. I mean, I'm pretty resilient to horror, but I swear to you, I felt little dolls running across my bed after I put it down at night. It is the one thing that made me look in the corners when I got up in the middle of the night. It's YA, dolls, evil dolls. It's just like hits me right where, yeah.
Evil dolls. Oh no. I don't know if I can do that. Oh.
Well, George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo, which of course many people read, but if you haven't read it, historical fiction, but it has a fantasy-like element because it's dealing with it's dealing with ghosts, and it is written in, I would say, a fairly innovative way. I think it was challenging for a lot of people to start because you're looking at internal monologues on a level that a ghost's internal monologue, and sometimes internal monologues that are crossing and overlapping. But I think that one of the things that Saunders does that I love so much is there's a sense of heart in the book, and this sense of optimism about humanity, even in some very, very dark writing, that afterwards I just felt better about the world, my life, the mortal coil. I mean, not to overstate it too much, but to me it was a truly beautiful piece of writing and it was something that I would not even dare to tackle, but because he has, I feel more confident about attacking some of the really big questions.
Actually, Megan, when Innovation came up, that was the first book that came to mind. It's spectacular.
Yeah, that's on my TBR. I've read some of his short stories, which are just beautiful. But I've not tackled that one because I've been a little intimidated by it, to be totally honest, but I need to get back to it. Well, we've actually had a really great conversation. I feel like I only have time for one of our kind of submitted questions, so I'm going to try to pick a good one. So for folks watching, there was a call out for questions for the different panels, so I'm going to pull from that. A lot of these are questions around kind of craft. So I think, let's see here, to that kind of a recurring theme here is how do you craft a reveal that isn't predictable? And what is the hardest part of keeping the reader guessing throughout the story? So this idea of like how, kind of what Callie and Grady were talking about earlier, if you read a lot in the genre, you definitely kind of know the plot beats of like, okay, well, I see you snuck in that red herring here or whatever. So when you're kind of approaching a new book and all the tricks in the toolbox, tools in the toolbox. How about that? How do you kind of go about trying to keep people guessing?
I'm a debut author, so I'm going to let the more experienced people dive in first.
I get very attached to my characters, and so I'm resistant to throwing things at them. But even when I was writing Category 5, I was walking on the beach, and I'm like, I got to throw more crap at her, and you just have to sort of not protect them, and that's one of my problems is I do get attached. But really, the most compelling books are the ones where you're just continually throwing things in their path.
You can't underestimate your reader's intelligence. I think that's the main thing. So if you're plotting something, you need to think to yourself as an author, what is the most obvious thing that this is going to lead to? Or what are people going to guess that, interestingly, we had an Instagram read along for strangers. And for the first time, I was able to get an insight into my readers' heads because they were asked questions. So, page 166, what do you think is in the locked basement door? And it was so fascinating to see people go, it's a body. Oh, no, that's too obvious. I think it's and that's what you need to do as the reader. You need to stay a step ahead of your readers to go through all of those possibilities that they think might happen and then do something else. Because the worst thing that you can get in a review is predictable. When somebody says to me, I did not guess that ending, or you kept me wrong-footed, I thought I had it, and then you threw in a curveball, but it still made sense, then I'm like, yes. But of course, some readers are going to guess, especially if they read widely in the genre. but you've just got to stay ahead because, you know, like we said already, so many of these topics have been covered: missing children, psycho exes, toxic friends, twin sisters, you know, all of the sort of tropes of the psych thriller genre have been done. So you've got to do something a bit different to keep the readers guessing.
I think that's true. I think that for me, I think the main thing is having the plot and the characters otherwise feel rich enough that if someone does guess it, it's not the end of their relationship with the book. I think that I think it can be really easy, you know, a twist ending that feels like there was information there that the author actually deliberately withheld from you in a way that doesn't feel real or something like that. And it almost feels like it's breaking a trust with the reader. I personally don't like those. I think that if there's, no matter what, there's going to be people who guess twists, whether by luck or they're just very clever readers or whatever. So I think in the way I write, I kind of have it, I want to plan it so if there's going to be some type of twist, I want it to feel that even if a reader does guess it, then they can just feel very clever with themselves and then otherwise continue to enjoy the book, and that's fine.
That is a satisfying reading experience, I think, when you know, correctly are like, oh, I bet this is what they're doing, and then that is what they're doing. That does feel good.
I mean, worst comes to worst, if the reader then just feels very happy with themselves, I mean, that's not necessarily
it's not terrible.
Yeah, for me, it's emotional engagement. Like, I always know what the ending of my books are going to be before I start them. And I usually have an idea for a couple of the big set pieces. And often most of those, except for one, will disappear. But I really, it's got to be emotionally engaging. You have to be, these characters can't be half-assed. You have to know everything about them. You have to be really, or for me at least, I have to be really invested in them. And then like Anne was saying, you just figure out what's the worst thing that could possibly happen to them and you do it to them, which is hard. You know, I knew that someone was going to suffer a particularly horrific attack in Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. And I thought it was one character. When I got there, I was like, oh, it'd be so much worse if it was this other character. And I realized when I made it the other character, it was so awful. I felt really bad about it. I could leave everything about the attack completely off the page and it had the same impact. One of my characters is really concerned with cleaning. And at the last minute, I was like, oh, I haven't done anything in this book to get her really dirty, to really have her like sort of in a really squalid, upsetting, gross, abjectly disgusting environment, because that's what she's most scared of. So to me, it's the emotional engagement. Like Elizabeth was saying about Rebecca, like you see that plot coming miles away, but you're so invested in the narrator whose name you don't even know. You're so invested in her point of view that every time something happens, it doesn't matter if it's a clever twist or not. You feel it viscerally.
Yeah. Well, guys, I've so enjoyed this conversation. We got through this much quicker than I thought we would, much slower. I thought we were going to be having more time for questions. But the last thing I do want to leave off with, because this question was inspired because I was trying to get my hands on the books that were out yet for y'all. And it was quite challenging in this current situation. Shout out to Parnassus Books. They were the only ones who had any available. That's my local independent bookstore. So you should, anyway, people should be supporting those in these times. But from y'all's perspective, what is the best way that readers can support these new books that are coming out? I have the links below, but I mean, is it library? I mean, what can people do to kind of support you guys in these new releases?
Start a book club with your friends.
Okay.
Like I have a number of friends who have not necessarily had a book club before, but they're like, look, I'm going crazy at home in whatever situation I'm in. I need to get together with my friends online. We're going to read a book at whatever pace we want. And then they realize, you know, your favorite authors are also at home, stuck at home. And so they might be willing to come and visit. And so I have a number of book clubs, friends and family who I'm going to come visit over the next month because that makes my day too.
Oh, I love that idea.
Who has an upcoming book? Because mine just came out April 7th. Elizabeth?
Yeah.
And Anne?
Mine came out April 7th too.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the thing you can do to support an author is to pre-order their book. That is huge. Pre-orders count towards your first week of sales, which is like your biggest shot at getting on the New York on a like bestseller lists, which is big for an author. And also it lets bookstore buyers know that there's a demand, so they order more. It's pre-ordering is huge for an author. And then the other thing is one thing, because my book tour got canceled. People are making this big thing about cancel versus postpone. It was canceled. But one of the things I saw was all these independent bookstores really turn on a dime and go from being brick and mortar establishments to doing mail order and curbside drop off and delivery and to doing virtual events and things like that. And I order from Amazon all the time. I've got something waiting for me at home now, but independent bookstores need it right now. Amazon's going to be here next year. These guys might not. And the book may be a couple of bucks more if you order, and most bookstores are using bookshop.org as their sales fulfillment platform online. They get a fee of that. That's, but the money goes to them. But it may be a couple of bucks more. Like I think on Amazon, Southern Book Club's like 16, and on Bookshop it's like 20. That $4 is a tax we pay to have neighbors, to know the faces of the people who sell our books, to have people who know us. My local bookstore checks in on my mom once a week when they drop off her new books on her front porch. Amazon doesn't do that. A drone will not do that. Like, it's invaluable. And when we lose these places, they don't come back. So order from an indie bookstore and pre-order an author's book.
Yeah, I've been sort of pushing my readers to order from Max Minerva's, which is a bookshop on the other side of Bristol. It's basically a husband and wife. They are the only people who work in the bookshop. So as a sweetener to readers, because it is more expensive to get it from there than it is from the supermarket or from Amazon, I'm handwriting a note to each person who orders it and giving them a signed book plate and a bookmark. So that way they get something special, because I'll never be, hopefully the pandemic is not going to be around next April, but this is going to be the only time I'm doing this. So if you want something, I'll date it as well, so we can all remember that's when C.L. Taylor sent notes out because she couldn't sign books. And people have been doing it. And the bookshop said to me, thank you, you've single-handedly helped us pay our bills this month. So, Amazon wouldn't care less if, people order my books there or not. But for anybody in the UK watching, if you want to find one close to you, although Max Minerva's will send anywhere, including abroad, somebody ordered from Australia, www.hive.co.uk, and then you can choose a bookshop that is in your local area who will benefit from you buying it independently.
Oh, that's good perspective. Yeah. So in the States, bookshop.org, UK, hive.co.uk. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we are at time, guys. I so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. This will be up on my channel, so anybody who missed it, who's seeing in the future, hello. Thank you to everybody who is watching live, and thank you so much to this wonderful group for just a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.